Nice seeing you.
Yeah.
All. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So let me just.
I knew this
so
was a bad idea.
You've been an advocate of trans service. You've been helping to manage and smooth out edges if there were any, and don't ask, don't tell. But I'd like to know what you have advocated for and succeeded, because if we had every secretary of every military service, and I want people to know this because we had initiated an idea a way back of bringing them all together, it was remarkable to see the enthusiasm that the various secretaries had about opening up service to every person. And I'd like you to take us down that path for a minute.
Well, the path starts a very long time ago, my experience anyhow. And in fact, the Secretary of the Air Force, Debbie James, she and I worked together in my first job 25 years ago on the Hill, went to the Pentagon together at the very start of the Clinton administration, before Don't Ask, Don't Tell existed, and when it was created, while it was created. And that certainly left an impression on me. I ended up leaving government altogether after a while, just thinking it wasn't compatible, or that part of government was not compatible for me. But for all of us then to come back eventually as service secretaries in different runs. I worked for Ray Mabus when he was Navy Secretary. I worked for Debbie James when she was Air Force Secretary, before I became Army Secretary. But I think this president campaigned on repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And it was strange to go back to the Pentagon in 2009 to an institution that still discriminated. But knowing the president had pledged to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell gave you something to work towards. And I don't know if many people remember, but we were getting near the end of the first 2 years, getting to the midterms, and we were struggling to get that repeal, to effect the repeal, at the same time that the president was trying to pass the New START treaty. And a lot of people were saying, you only have enough political ammunition to get one of those across. And New START's existential. But the president went for both, got both, and I was thinking I'm going to have to leave government again because I can't stay in this institution if the Republicans take over a chamber and we can't get Don't Ask, Don't Tell repealed. But it was incredibly smooth, and it feels like ancient history now in many ways because of what else we've been able to do since then.
Well, you got L's and G's, and then you decided to go down the alphabet.
Well, yeah, a lot of people didn't realize that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was just the L and the G, and that the transgender ban was an entirely different thing in a different set. And even before we went after the transgender ban, we were systemically opening up every single MOS, all combat positions, to women.
Right.
So that was happening as well. And I think for a lot of people, the transgender service just seemed like the next. I think a lot of people expected it was coming. I know a lot of people in the Pentagon were like, when are you going to do it? What's going on? What's the timeline here and what's happening? And it kind of got a pretty quick spark with Secretary Carter. And the first weekend he was in office, he was asked a question about transgender service in austere environments on a trip to Afghanistan. And I was his chief of staff at the time. These trips are exhausting. I was just standing in the back of the room. I remember this hangar in Kandahar, Afghanistan, and I hear transgender. That woke me up real fast. And he answered.
And you said, "Oh boy," or
I just remember going.
Do it,
it took me a second in the context of being in that place. And if you've never been to Kandahar, it's about as dusty a place as you can go to. So everything's brown, and it just was completely out of context. And I had out on my list of things to discuss with him, as I'm sure other people did, but it was literally day 5 of his tenure, and he answered the question without any prep. And usually you try to have something in mind for all the questions or a good pivot, but he went ahead and answered it straight on and essentially said, if you can do the job, why shouldn't you be allowed to do the job? And the huddle, gathers afterwards, and the press people that were with him said, we're sorry, we didn't prep you. The proper answer to that question is it's a medical condition, and we answer it down that path. And Secretary Carter is strong-willed, outspoken, and he paused for a second, and he kind of leans back, and he's like, no, I like my answer better. And for a couple of weeks, he would just kind of say that in the middle of any conversation. I'm like, hey, run with it, I like it too. And off we went on transgender, and then are quickly, I think, doing a number of important and long overdue things in the area of religious accommodation as well.
So you are civilians. Ash Carter is a civilian.
Yes.
You have civilian secretaries of the other services. How has this really revolutionary change been adopted or not by those wearing uniform at the highest level of the service? I know you work with General Milley and the Chief of Staff of the Army, but how deep is this commitment in the military leadership who are wearing uniforms?
Well, you said senior leadership, and what I always have to remember is I am surrounded by senior leadership. And I get a different reaction and an answer to these issues than when I go out into the field and interact with younger soldiers. In fact, it's kind of a funny thing, you know, that the senior level, there might be resistance for very different reasons. Then you deal with the sort of mid-grade officers, and they're like, well, we can figure that out. And then you go to junior officers or junior soldiers and younger soldiers, and they look at you like you're crazy for even asking. Like, they're already doing it, by the way. I mean, in many ways, policy is just catching up to reality. We have transgender soldiers serving, and
how many?
Dealing with, we don't know the numbers, actually. The only hard and fast numbers we have are those who have submitted first for exceptions to policy while we were creating the policy, and then to begin the process to change. Essentially, it's the switch is changing your gender marker in the system, the human resources system. And right now, the numbers are still pretty low. We have back channel sense of who's waiting to see what happens and what's coming, but can only talk about what's public. But there were soldiers, while we were debating this, already serving and presenting in their preferred gender, target gender, and commanders at different levels were dealing with it. And in fact, when Secretary Carter was thinking about this and talking to us about this, he said, I don't know what I don't know. I'm presuming we're going to do this, and I want to do it in a way where they feel welcomed. And third, we're doing this because commanders are having to deal with it, and they don't have guidance on how to deal with it. And we owe it to those commanders to have this guidance. But I went to a base, Fort Jackson, where we do most of our basic training. And so I was there specifically for basic training. The commander says, oh, we've got a transgender drill instructor. We had a male drill instructor who's now a drill instructor in the Army. He was at drill instructor training. And he says, you want to meet him? I'm like, well, yeah, I want to meet him. And then he said, no, by the way, we've also got a Sikh, and we're dealing with it. You know, we figured it out at this level. And so in many ways, the policy is just catching up in what people are already doing in the field. It really is a generational thing that's moved very quickly. The difference in the Pentagon, just on Don't Ask, Don't Tell on gay and lesbian issues since I was there and started in '93 is pretty crazy.
So when we do this forum in 2017, it'll be the third annual LGBTQ plus forum. Are we going to be looking back at this conversation I've had with you as the high point of inclusive service? We've had an election. Donald Trump is coming in. That's a fact. Are you worried about the resilience of these changes you've made?
I think we have more to do, so this is definitely not the high point. But you know, this path has never been a purely linear path. But it is very hard to roll back these things. And I use Don't Ask, Don't Tell as my example for this.
I can imagine Vice President Mike Pence listening to this right now and saying, that sounded like a challenge.
I can't imagine Vice President-elect Mike Pence listening to this, I don't think it's who knows? I think once you implement something, there are all sorts of things you can do to slow it down.
So what do you think makes these changes resilient? What do you think keeps them from being rolled back?
For me, I'd say three things. You're not supposed to use numbers, but three things. One is society is changing so quickly. It really is. And we're assessing young soldiers now who just come from a different world. And they really don't understand why we're discussing some of these things or how we're discussing some of these things. Two, it is easier, as difficult as it can be, to implement regs than to roll them back oftentimes. And three, a part of that is because it is one thing to have a debate about whether someone should be able to put on a uniform. It's an entirely different thing to say to someone who has a uniform on, you've got to take it off. And that is a very different conversation for senior uniformed leadership.
How do you find, you went through a tough confirmation process, and you were out there as acting secretary, then pulled back, and then went back again and were confirmed. In your interactions, particularly with the GOP side of the Senate, and them knowing very well that you were gay and that these ideas on a more inclusive service was coming, can you share with us anything that you can share about your sense of where the GOP leadership is on these issues?
Well, it never came up even once, and as far as I can tell, even obliquely. And I know the the narrative, what actually happens is more confusing than what played out in the press, because there
Give
were a
us
number
the
of
real
things going
detail
on.
that we missed.
It's a long story. I mean, Chairman McCain was holding everybody
Right.
over issues that had nothing, in fact, to do with the Department of Defense, and we resolved those at the very end of last year. And started moving forward on hearings, and mine was they were all lined up very quickly. And that's when Senator Roberts placed the hold on me, and we knew that was coming. He had done the exact same thing for the exact same reason to my predecessor 6 years earlier, who had been a Republican congressman from New York. And so I didn't think it had anything to do with me. In fact, it was about Guantanamo detainees and whether or not they could move to Leavenworth, which is the only military supermax. But military supermax is very, very different than civilian supermax. Leavenworth is open bay. Farmland goes right up to almost to the walls of the prison. It's not the same as the supermax in Colorado. In fact, I was touring it once, and 75% of those incarcerated at Leavenworth are there for sexual crimes. Then we go to this barbershop where they're training inmates, because we try to train, we really do try to make it a rehabilitation facility. And there are all these prisoners in there with shears and scissors and learning their wear, and I'm standing in the middle of the room, and the warden says, it's a funny thing about Kansas, you can't get a license as a barber, you can't be certified as a barber if you've been convicted of sexual crimes. And I'm like, but you told me that was 75% of the inmates. Oh yeah, these are all murderers. And I'm pretty sure Ray back there had a heart attack and came running out of me. But we knew there weren't going to be TJs.
Yeah.
But he was trying to make a point. And the narrative was he's holding Fanning because Fanning is gay. I take him at his word. I'm pretty certain that he had no idea who I was until that first headline broke. And I'm sure he went back to his office and said, who the hell's Fanning and why'd we pick him? Because he clearly was uncomfortable with that narrative. And it created this bizarre situation for me where he was, we said, just let the vote go and vote against me. And he said, well, I want to vote for you. So you had the chairman of the committee, Senator McCain, and the person with the hold, Senator Roberts, two long-term Senate Republicans, twice on the floor of the Senate arguing over who thought I was the most qualified for the job, which is a bizarre thing to watch as a appointee of a Democratic president. But the silver lining is that it got me a lot of attention and built a lot of relationships on that side of the aisle that I might not have had before. And I had the chairman of the committee, a Republican, really acting as my campaign manager.
How much time do you spend on these kinds of issues that you're leading a transformation of service in the military? You're gay, you're a social media guy, which I'll get into in a minute, and you're sort of this avant-garde army secretary versus talking about the number of the weaponry your soldiers have, the life your soldiers are living, basing issues, deployment issues. How do you get irritated that you get typecast as the gay secretary, so you have to talk about gay stuff as opposed to war fighting?
No, it was a process for me as well. Each time that I was moved into a new job, that was the headline again. My name went from Eric Fanning to gay man.
So you must have
during that process.
Yeah.
But I thought, okay, the first time it happened, like, okay, it's out there. Everybody knows. This makes it easy. It's
Right.
the biggest coming out party you could have at the Pentagon. But it kept coming back, and particularly in this
Kind of
job.
imagine that as a reality TV show, right?
Well, it sort of made
Yeah.
it's like, okay, now everybody knows, we can put that aside. I mean, it really isn't an issue at work. But people issues are a huge part of the job. There's 1.1 million people in uniform in the Army, 250,000 civilians. The Army is the second largest employer in the country behind Walmart. So personnel issues are a big part of what I do. But capabilities, acquisition, the future is a big part of what I talk about. Well, it's just different audiences, perhaps. But implementing these changes to increase opportunities for people who didn't have them before and increase the base from which we can recruit does take a lot of time, because you want to make sure you get it right, so you don't have guinea pigs going through the system, but that you've figured out all the puts and takes and have it all laid out in the policy for the commanders and for the soldiers going through it. It seems a little crazy at times, because we have the military is actually pretty good at it integrating. Going back to 1947, I think, when we integrated the military, Truman integrated African Americans in the military. We
Right.
pay women equal wages for what they do as men right now. But over and over and over, and especially what we've done this last administration, you see the same arguments against it that are the same arguments that were used in 1947, and they are proven wrong each time. But it's the same arguments they trot out. But I think we have this rhythm now where, and we keep looking at it as these individual things that we've done: African Americans, women, transgender, don't ask, don't tell, religious accommodation. But if you look at that holistically, you're really talking about setting clear standards tied directly to the job and saying, if you can meet those standards, you can do the job.
Yeah, but that sounds good. But as I grew up as a military brat, my father was in the Air Force, and I haven't often acknowledged this. My father was a member of something called the Office of Special Investigations that not only did counterintelligence stuff, but essentially tried to seek out gay service members and then have them expelled or charged and various kinds of things. So this was my dad, who was part of the force of evil, and he's a good guy, but tasked with these sorts of things. When I moved to Washington in the mid-1990s, there was a guy named John Hillen at CSIS that would writing a lot, publishing a lot about the social society military gap, and that the military had a culture that had to be divorced and distant from what was going on in society. And so I'm interested in you described something where the military has been good at this and inclusive for a long time, but I just have a different sense, and wondering, are there any hangers-on for that world who argue that the code and norms of the military ought not to look like American society?
This clock says 7 minutes and 30 seconds, and this is you just did a 7-day question. I mean, there are many ways to look at what you said. I worry about the military needs to be above society politically, perhaps, divorced from that, needs to be apolitical in that regard. But I disagree strongly with the notion that it needs to be divorced from society at large. To me, that's dangerous. First of all, it's bad for me in trying to build the best force I can, because if you're just recruiting if you're recruiting a military like that, you're recruiting from society like that. So you should have been in the military, for example, because your dad was in it. Certain geographic parts of the country. We need to blow past all that. 40, and it's, I don't know what year your dad joined the military, but we're 40 plus years into the all-volunteer force,
60s.
which has yielded the strongest, the best, most professional force we've ever had, but has added to this separation between the military and the rest of civil society. And it is an issue. And it's
I was ROTC and signed up, and then we got a scholarship. You get that 2-year point saying, are you a homosexual? And if you go for the next 2 years, you're in big trouble if you at that time, if you didn't disclose, if you did disclose, you were out.
Well, when I started, it would be grounds for denying a security clearance. But I don't see those vestiges. Yes, that was there. We're still dealing with some of these cases, records we're trying to correct and so forth. And it's remarkable to me that some of these things were happening when I was in college. But I don't see those vestiges. I mean, one thing you'll say about doing these series of things is it inoculates the things that have come before, because you're changing the focus. But we see in doing this now that I think, Don't Ask, Don't Tell in particular, it just hit with a dull thud. It was, it was the process laid out to get to the decertification of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a lengthy one, and it seemed slow, painfully slow to a lot of people. But the effect of it was, by the time the president signed this, many in the building were like, didn't we already do this? I thought this was, what did he do today? I thought we did this a long time ago. And I think that's sort of in people's minds. There are a lot of people in the military who think that they should look out into the formation and everybody should look alike. That's, I think, the vestige that maybe people are hanging on to. But when I look out and see something that resembles what I see in the United States of America, I think that's good and I think that's healthy. But society needs to know what the military is, so they understand the debate on how to use it and how to resource it. I'm not on record for having an opinion on whether we should have gone to war in Iraq. Nobody would have asked me at that time in my career.
Should we have gone to war in Iraq?
No. But what I remember at the time is thinking, we should be having a debate about this, and we're not having a debate about this. And that growing divide, the smallest percentage of veterans in Congress we've ever had, smallest percentage of veterans in the country we've ever had, makes that debate harder, and people need to know, so the citizens need to know why they have it, what it's doing, and have a voice in what it's doing, and then decide, and the question about how to resource it.
So until November 9th, you were under restrictions of something called the Hatch Act, and you were unable to express your concern. This mic sucks. Excuse me. I'm interested now, Do you have concerns about Donald Trump as president and what it might do to the military and your concerns?
Well, I always have concerns. That's my job.
You'd have concerns if Hillary Clinton were there?
It's all about risk.
Yeah,
I mean, my job is to balance risk. That's essentially what a service secretary's job comes down to, I think.
So what are your big concerns about a Trump presidency coming in and the people that he would have come into the Pentagon to lead?
Well, I don't know who he's going to have coming in. We haven't really started the transition process.
Have they reached out to you
yet? Well, I don't know when they'll get to me. They haven't come to the building yet.
Yeah, they have not come to the building yet.
As Secretary Carter said, they have not.
You were in the
building
transition
yet.
with Les Aspin as he came in after George H.W. Bush.
That's right.
By this time, had you guys reached out to the elder Bush's Pentagon?
Yeah, we had. I mean, we had people ready to go. It's disruptive at start, even if you know what's going on. I mean, remember, we were dealing with a Pentagon that lost re-election, and so they weren't maybe in the most cooperative mood in some ways. But our
how did
goal,
that compare
first
to
and
this?
Foremost, well, it's hard to tell because it's early yet. It hasn't really started yet. I mean, one thing having now worked on the incoming side of two transitions is, first of all, almost everything you hear is not true. And second of all, the names discussed in November are not usually the people that are showing up in January with boxes. So, this still has to play out in many ways. We have to be committed to doing everything we can to make this transition as smooth as possible. There are Army soldiers in 150 countries right now and at war. I mean, we can use whatever words we want to use, but there are soldiers in combat in harm's way right now, and there cannot be a seam or a gap. It has to be as smooth as possible transition. And that's what I worry about. It is a very complicated world right now, very convoluted, and
Did you go hang out at the cafeteria with guys that may not know you, men and women who may not know you, and get a sense of their feeling either about Trump or how about this Russia thing? How's that going down?
Well, it's, the role of a service secretary, first of all, I'm like a business unit CEO. I mean, I produce a product. I'm not usually in the building determining what happened. The Syria plan is developed by generals. I'm making sure there's an army to implement it.
But you hear the gossip, right?
Yeah. And I can't go to the cafeteria in the Pentagon and generally be unrecognized. I can certainly go out into the field because I don't look, I'm not wearing a uniform. So,
right.
So usually you can hide for a little bit before they figure out where. I mean, I was with a bunch of West Point cadets at a game a couple weeks ago, standing next to them, and one of them says, "We hear the Secretary of the Army's coming up to see us later today." So what would you tell him if you could tell him anything you wanted to? But yeah, I mean, they're committed to the mission. I mean, people who join up, especially now, are really committed to the mission. But they're confused. They don't necessarily know what it is they're being asked to do, what the end state is. And so that's usually what they're talking about.
Just as we're closing out, one of the other interesting things I know from your team is that you're very dedicated to making greater connections with the public at large, particularly young people, and using social media to do that. And so what's your thinking there? How's it going?
Well, it started A, to have a little fun, but B, a focus of mine has been trying to communicate the Army to places that don't know about the Army. As we have fewer installations now. We recruit, as I said, from sort of
so do you have
demographically
Snapchat?
targeted areas.
Eric Fanning Snapchat?
There is. It's SecArmy, not Eric Fanning.
SecArmy, yeah.
We have to keep it separate, but we're on all those things. It was to try and reach new audiences. You got to go where people are communicating to try to get the Army story in there a little bit. It grew really quickly among soldiers and other people in uniform, which was kind of fun because we're learning a lot that way, and it's made my trips a lot more interesting because senior commanders want to control everything, put me in a room with no windows and do PowerPoints all day long, something I could do in my office. But the soldiers who are going to be with me see what I'm doing, and so they try to prep it that way. And even the commanders now are saying, well, we saw what you did in your last trip, so we've adjusted fire, and we're going to take you outside once or twice. But it's been a lot of fun, and I think one of the hardest parts about leaving will be I don't want to say ending that conversation, but it'll morph in some way.
Well, just as we close out here, I'm going to take a selfie with you in front of this great banner here because, as I mentioned when we were introducing you, may be the only Secretary of the Army anyone is ever going to know or remember. I challenged the audience and name one Secretary of the Army that anyone can do. So here we do. As we take it, a big round of applause for Eric Fanning. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you.